Okay, I assume more people are going to continue to trickle in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline Parker, and I'm here on behalf of the LPE project to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us. As you all know, we had hoped to gather in person last April 2020 for the Democracy Beyond Neoliberalism conference. However, thanks to the patience and resilience of this community, we are thrilled to be hosting this virtual conference series instead. Our entire lineup of events and registration links, as well as a sneak peek at our upcoming blog symposia, are available through our website, lpeproject.org, where you can also sign up for conference-specific updates and reminders. Our next conference event, titled Critical Theory and Law Reform, will take place on Thursday, April 22nd April 22nd at noon Eastern. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's student moderator, Kevin Chen, who's a 1L at Yale Law School and an incoming board member of Yale's LPE student group. Kevin is passionate about environmental justice and interested in the role of environmental law in challenging racial and economic inequality. You can take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm incredibly excited for this panel, and I hope that all of you in the audience are as well. Thank you to the LPE project for hosting this event, and thank you in advance to all our panelists for what I know will be a generative and timely conversation on intersectional environmentalism and the Biden administration. For tonight's event, we're hoping to switch up the format a little bit to incorporate more of an open-ended and interactive group conversation among the panelists. After brief introductions, the panelists will each give a short presentation on their work and research. And afterwards, we will move into the group conversation portion. For those of you in the audience, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A or chat functions at any time during the event. And we will incorporate those questions into the discussion. Before getting started, I want to acknowledge that I am joining in from the land of the Atakapa Ishak, who have stewarded the lands and waterways of what is now known as the Gulf Coast for generations. As we will be discussing throughout this event, we must center questions of land, indigeneity, and decolonization in the environmental movement in order to fully address the multiple crises that we find ourselves in, and to build and imagine a truly sustainable and regenerative world for all. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists for tonight in the order in which they will be presenting. Michalyn Steele is a professor of law at the J. Reuben Clark Law School at Brigham Young University. Her areas of expertise include civil rights, constitutional law, federal Indian law, indigenous rights, and race and social justice. Sarah Krakoff is a Moses Lasky Professor of Law at the University of Colorado Law School. She is a nationally recognized expert in Native American law, natural resources law, and environmental justice. Ann Eisenberg is an associate professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. Her research applies the lines of law and political economy to rural marginalization, examining how law, policy, and public institutions influence rural economic opportunity. Sharmila Murthy is an associate professor and director of faculty scholarship and research at Suffolk University Law School. She teaches and writes on issues of property law, environmental law, international environmental law, poverty, and human rights. And Maxine Burkett is a professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii, and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. An expert in the law and policy of climate change, she has presented her work on diverse areas of climate law throughout the United States and in West Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Caribbean. So with that, we're going to get started and jump into our short presentations, starting with Professor Steele.
Thank you. Thank you to the Yale Law and Political Economy Group for inviting us to convene as a panel and for following up, even though we were displaced last year by the pandemic's ravages. I'm coming to you from Utah, from the traditional homelands of the Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples. I'm a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians. My homelands are in what is now Western New York. So I wanted to talk today about cultural sovereignty and the ways in which The Indigenous voices and Indigenous values ought to be, as Kevin said, centered, not just consulted, but invited in the conversations on environmental protection going forward, particularly in the Biden administration. There seems to be both a will and a momentum to invite Indigenous voices and values into these conversations in ways that we have not seen in the past. And that's very exciting. And so the two things that I would suggest as that we keep in mind as we formulate policy in this era is, as I said, the incorporation of Indigenous values to help heal the nation and to heal the earth, to heal the people. There are principles that have helped Indigenous people to survive a great many assaults and onslaughts and outside disruptions through many generations. And if we can incorporate, we as an American people can look to and incorporate, be informed by some of those values, which I'll talk about in just a minute, I think it would be wisdom, right? It wouldn't, not just to consult tribal voices, but to listen to them. And the second principle that I hope would drive President Biden's environmental agenda is respect for Indigenous sovereignty. It's the cultural sovereignty, the economic sovereignty, the environmental sovereignty, and of course the political sovereignty of tribes going forward. I think the Biden administration is off to a great start. I'm sure my fellow panelists will have more to say about the ways that there is some reason for hope. I think the nomination and confirmation of Deb Haaland to lead the Interior Department is not just as a matter of representation, but in the substance of the way that her Indigenous values will inform the governance of that institution, and the stewardship of the lands will be transformative, potentially. And similarly, I saw that President Biden had recently nominated Bob Anderson as the solicitor for the Department of Interior. Again, elevating Indigenous values, not just as a sort of we often get sort of tacked on at the end of lists. Native Americans get sort of tacked on to the end of lists or incorporated in the other category, but bringing to the fore those voices and values, I think, will be incredibly important. So what do I mean when I say policy that's informed by Indigenous values? I'm thinking specifically of several Indigenous principles that if we were to, as an American people, incorporate these values and let our decisions be informed by these values, how might that transform the way we manage our resources and the way we care for one another and for the water and the plants and the animals. One particular value, just a couple, there are many, of course, and they differ from tribe to tribe, but there are a couple of values that I think are widely shared in Indigenous communities throughout the United States and beyond. One is the value of the 7 generations principle, and you've probably heard this in other contexts. But for the Seneca people or the Haudenosaunee people, in our Constitution, our original Constitution, there was a requirement that those who were designated as representatives to the Confederacy were required to consider the impacts of their decisions on the next 7 generations. and it was grounds to be removed. Interestingly enough, it was grandmothers who held the power to remove from office people who acted in self-interest and people who failed to take the long-term view. In other words, how might it change our policies? How might it change the way we develop resources if we were holding our representatives and those in authority to account, if we required them to consider the effects of their decisions on the next 7 generations? So that's one principle that I would love to see the United States adopt a more Indigenous way of being in holding our leaders to account and in taking a longer term view. Another principle that comes out of the Haudenosaunee tradition is the idea of one dish, one spoon. This was a law that governed territory that was shared and resources that were shared. It meant we all eat out of the same dish. And so it was a way of diffusing self-interest, of checking self-interest, to understand that everybody needs to be sustained from these shared common resources. How might that principle guide policy if it were to be adopted or centered? The idea of kinship. We see in some ways emerging the idea of waters with rights or etc. But the idea of kinship, that one of the things we saw driving the Standing Rock protests was the idea that there were people whose job it was within the community to speak for the waters. Who speaks for the waters? Who speaks for the plants? Who speaks for the animals? And so that kinship of all things, it's kind of like the idea that Dr. King wrote from Birmingham jail. He meant it in a different context, but that we're all interrelated, that we're all tied in a single garment of destiny. And so how might those values inform the way we manage resources? And then to conclude, I'll talk about the idea of sovereignty, where what do I mean by cultural sovereignty, environmental sovereignty? I mean, not just consultation, which has too often meant that a plan gets presented to the tribes and they don't have much say in shaping that. They don't have the power to sign off on the way their interests, whether it be in sacred sites or in cultural resources, or even in the development of resources, that they get presented a plan and told what's going to happen, and then that gets labeled consultation. What would meaningful input by the tribes mean to elevate Indigenous voices going forward? I think the Biden administration has a tremendous opportunity to change these histories. And I would love to see how they do that. And I'm encouraged by the initial signs of inclusion that I've seen. So with that, I really look forward to the presentations from my panelists and the discussion to follow. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Steele. Next we have Professor Krakoff.
Great, hi, thanks. Thanks everyone, thanks for hosting this. Kevin and Raul and the other LPE students and staff, and my fellow panelists. It always makes me a little sad actually to see the faces of these people I enjoy so much in their little squares, because it has this perverse effect of making me miss you all more. So here's to what we hope is the end of this seemingly endless pandemic. And I want to preview what might be necessary as an apology to the audience. Speaking of pandemic, that's my Band-Aid. I had my second COVID shot just about 7 hours ago, which is when they say the ill effects start to kick in. So I'm feeling okay, if a little spacey. I first just wanted to say very, very briefly a little something about the origin of our group, which includes the 5 of us, but also linking to the Biden administration, also Shalonda Baker, a group we met 2 summers ago now to talk about this concept of intersectional environmentalism. And I'll say a word about that in a second, but the reason Shalonda's not with us is because she is in the Department of Energy. She is the first ever deputy in the Department of Energy in charge of climate justice. I'm sure I'm not saying her exact title correctly, but that's just so exciting. And her work, her career has been devoted to writing about energy justice and disparate distribution of the harms of energy production and the benefits of environmental protection. So that gives us additional reason to the ones that Michalyn mentioned to be feeling optimistic, even if we know that government will, as it always does, disappoint us in some ways. At least we'll be disappointed from a much higher bar, I think, at least than ever in my lifetime, really ever in my lifetime. And so our concept, which I want to say is in many ways not new, and we have many people around the country, around the world who preceded us and work alongside us, who also work on what I think of as this larger project of intersectional environmentalism. Several are in the LPE larger umbrella, including, of course, Angela Harris. So I'm not claiming we're striking out on something brand new, but here's, I think, a way of summarizing the concept, and it parallels very much the LPE approach, right, to the economy. It's instead of thinking of the environment as something natural that just exists out there, that laws can apply to and tinker with and shift, around things like fairness and justice at the margins. I think part of our shared idea is to make that notion less natural and to put, now picking up on something Michalyn already mentioned, at the center of thinking about what environmental advocacy and environmental scholarship and environmental thinking should be, the voices, experiences, and agency of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other people of color, also people who have been, put on the short end of the class stick, and also women and others who have been on the short end of the power stick in terms of how we're treated in terms of gender, right? To center those issues and look then at what environmental protection can and should mean through those experiences and those lenses. Very similar to the sort of intersectional approach to civil rights that was first championed, we know now, several decades ago. So we got together because we all work on environmental issues, but in different ways and not necessarily labeled as such, which is part of what I see as what is the promise of thinking about environmental law and environmental law scholarship through this lens. So just thought I'd mention that briefly. And so in my remaining few minutes, I'll try to give what is sort of a quick summary or a preview of some of the things I've been writing and thinking about for the last several years. So I've called this the political economy and geography of the Green New Deal. And the idea is to look at the ways that investment in infrastructure, investment in economic growth and development in the past, and in particular, starting with the New Deal, has shaped the relationships that different communities among us, different peoples have with place and landscape, different opportunities we have within place and landscape, and different just notions of what it means to protect the environment because of that distribution of resources at the outset, and then sort of to bring us up to date, like how a Green New Deal might work to unravel some of those inequalities. And so the particular place I've been studying these issues for the last several years and much more in depth over the last year is the Southwest, and in an area you might think of as the Greater Grand Canyon. And it's a place that, of course, was once all Indian country, and where many Native nations still have their reservations and homelands. but outside of the protected area we now know as Grand Canyon National Park. So it's to bring the Native nations into that larger geography of Grand Canyon. That's one step. And then the other step is to integrate the geography of Grand Canyon and the Native nations surrounding Grand Canyon today that were once, that was their homeland, to include all of the major cities of the Southwest, a significant percentage of which their energy, water, electricity, etc., come from that region around Grand Canyon. Sometimes we call the Colorado Plateau, that's what it is geologically. And to sort of see that whole landscape together and see the distribution of benefits, privileges, disparate effects from pollution as all connected to that larger geopolitical landscape. And I'll end just by sort of tracing one story through there to maybe make this a little more concrete. So Grand Canyon today, every summer, 20,000 people or more float the Colorado River through Grand Canyon on what seems like this, and it is a spectacular wilderness experience. 14 days without electricity, off all phones and cellular devices. It's the ultimate lower 48 wilderness experience. It, however, is bookended by two enormous dams, one of which was constructed in the New Deal. That's the Hoover Dam that backs up water in Lake Mead, and the Glen Canyon Dam, sort of the last gasping breath of those huge reclamation projects that started in the New Deal and then continued through the post-World War II prosperity period. And so that is a highly, in many ways, industrialized landscape. And those two dams are what have electrified the cities of Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson. And the wealth generated from those dams, including jobs, there were a lot of jobs produced in those periods, many publicly funded jobs because those dams were heavily subsidized. And a lot of the wealth generated, right, the buildup in the cities, the jobs that were accessible, were only accessible, we know, to certain kinds of people. And this is a story about the New Deal we all know already, which is, of course, as America was getting prosperous, Jim Crow was alive and well, the civil rights movement was very far off. So Black and brown people in those Southwestern cities, just like Black and brown people in cities in the South and the North, were impoverished as white middle and upper classes were getting wealthier because of the natural capital of the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon region. In parallel to this, the coal to fire coal-fired power plants, which became the complement to the dams, came from Indian country, ravaging the water resources and the lands through these huge strip coal mines. Some resources did flow to Indian country from those coal mines, but it barely scratched the surface in terms of the degree of in many instances, deliberate impoverishment because of the policies that prioritize getting coal out of the ground. So that the story of the dams, the buildup of the Southwest, in parallel with segregation, discrimination, and Jim Crow, left, of course, an unfinished New Deal for vast swaths of the population. So now I'll just fast forward quickly so we can pivot and I can hand off to our next panelist, to the Green New Deal. And so I wanted to give you that sense of geography, the political geography of the old New Deal, and to have, so we can think about the opportunities presented by the Green New Deal and the importance of investment in infrastructure as an investment in climate change and environmental protection, right? To achieve the equitable redistribution of environmental harms and environmental privileges in a region that was built up to provide environmental protection for some, including, the benefit of the Grand Canyon, and yet, the underdevelopment for the many requires a similarly just Herculean effort to reinvest and rethink what it means to have public investment in these kinds of projects. And one last word, and then I'll hand it off, is that there is a benefit to all the work that took place then, including the protection of vast swaths of public land. Whenever I do too much dumping on prior governmental actions, I want to highlight that the upside of things remaining in public hands is that there is the opportunity that Michalyn just described, right? That tribes can, all the lands that went out and were privatized out of Indian hands, you know, there's not an opportunity to come back and be able to participate in the governance and stewardship of those lands. Whereas in the public land arena, there is. And so, you know, with every, you know, sort of movement that was in many ways devastating for communities that weren't the beneficiaries of all that privilege, there is, I think, still today a tremendous amount of opportunity. And we can come back to talking more about that, hopefully during the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Krakoff. Next, we have Professor Eisenberg.
There we go. Okay, hi everyone. I'm so thrilled to be getting to participate in this panel this evening. I also know the conference organizers have put a lot of thought and work into pulling this and other great events in this series off in the face of the pandemic. So my sincere thanks to them for getting us together. So I am Annie Eisenberg, and I teach property and the environmental law clinic at the University of South Carolina School of Law. I have a somewhat early stage work in progress that I'll speak about briefly, but I think for purposes of this panel, it makes a bit more sense to just focus a bit more on the overall arc of my work. And then I hope during the conversation, I can bring it back to what the Biden administration is up to. So I write about law and rural communities. And specifically, I write about law as a shaper of rural communities. And what brought me to that scholarly agenda was the many conversations I kept having early in my career, where it was insisted upon that markets are the only forces shaping rural communities, and that markets are these self-driven, external magical things that simply can't be explained as anything other than the workings of economics. So I've heard over and over again that rural socioeconomic marginalization or massive losses of rural jobs or farms is just Mother Nature running her course, and that these things are inevitable and natural and should just be accepted. And so my methodology involves sort of looking into and interrogating the ways in which that's not really true, and the ways in which law shapes rural communities. And for purposes of this panel, I'm really interested in what rural sociologist Loka Ashwood calls rural environmental embeddedness, or the fact that at least historically, rural livelihoods and jobs typically had a deeper relationship with the environment than what we might think of as urban or suburban jobs. So traditional rural livelihoods have historically included employment or otherwise just making a living off of natural resource extraction like fishing, timbering, hunting, drilling, and mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. So from the point of view of conservation and climate change and environmentalism, this way of life can seem increasingly problematic. And so it raises these interesting and important questions about how best to approach the intersection of these issues. So my apologies for the shameless self-promotion, but if you can indulge me for a minute, I think understanding what I'm working on now and what I want to see from the Biden administration is easier in the context of this sort of overarching research agenda. So Just Transitions looked at the experiences of fossil fuel communities that have kind of been used and abused twice by society. Once to the abuses of the fossil fuel industry, which has never really been adequately regulated. And then the second time to the obsolescence of the fossil fuel industry. And I argued that justice requires some kind of intervention to help fossil fuel communities recover from their sacrifice. Distributive justice in rural America pointed out various modern policies that have, I argued, unjustly sacrificed rural communities in the name of the greater good or collective progress. One example being policies favoring farm consolidation, which have played a huge role in depopulating the rural landscape, but which we've been told are good and necessary to produce abundant, cheap food, even though this model for food production is not really feeding the world as promised. And then most recently, economic regulation in rural America looks at the legal history of utilities and common carrier regulation and argues that deregulation is really a glaring missing piece in the conversation on rural decline. So Congress in the late 19th through the mid 20th century established an apparatus through the Interstate Commerce Commission to ensure equitable geographic access to infrastructure services like transportation and telecommunications, which didn't really have natural incentives to serve rural communities because of their more remote and sparser populations. And the deregulatory era, from about the 1970s through the present, undid most of that, meaning that services like rural planes, buses, and telephones became more expensive and lower quality, which really hurt rural communities and made them a less desirable place to live and contributed to this cycle of socioeconomic decline many are facing. So for this latest project, I'm finally turning to this issue of so-called rural resentment, or the idea that mostly sociologists have been exploring, that rural populations, but in particular white conservative rural populations, feel left behind by the direction of society and have therefore become resentful or bitter toward outgroups, including liberals, urbanites, non-white populations, and the federal government itself. And I definitely don't purport to yet be able to even define or explain rural resentment fully. And I think it's really hard to separate from other versions of polarization that we see in our society today, like the simple rift we're all familiar with between Democrats and Republicans. But nonetheless, in this project, I'm asking specifically whether certain federal progressions may have contributed to rural resentment, as in maybe one in many factors shaping this complicated phenomenon. But in particular, it struck me as significant that the retreat of the economic regulatory state coincided with the sort of birth and increased intervention into rural life of the social regulatory state. And by social regulations, I mean regulations not governing common carriers and infrastructure industries, but regulations governing workplaces, natural resources, land use, and property. So I think of environmental law as the main sphere that's of interest here, although comparable legislation seeking to protect people evolved around the same time. So basically, Congress deregulated a bunch of sectors that rural communities needed disproportionately, and then started to, even if half-heartedly, regulate sectors that rural communities were likely disproportionately dependent on in light of rural environmental embeddedness. So from the point of view of a given rural person or population, at least from a particular perspective or set of fears, even if not necessarily backed up empirically, deregulation coinciding with these new and different regulations could have seemed like the federal government was pushing rural communities over with one hand and pulling the rug out from under them with the other. And ultimately, half of what I'm describing is this simple, classic, politically charged question of jobs versus the environment, and the question of whether environmental regulations contribute to job losses in particular sectors. And I know it can be tempting to be dismissive about the jobs versus environment question, since it is such an old and politicized trope. But I suspect it would be a good idea to engage with this question more, in part because it has the potential to get more acute and more widespread as efforts to address climate change hopefully ramp up. And so ultimately, if the answer to my research question is yes, the regulatory state has been a contributor to rural resentment by imposing poorly appreciated costs in rural communities, or being perceived as doing that, what are the implications for federal agencies and geographic considerations, distributional considerations, and democratic considerations in agency decision making? So I have a few slides on moves from the Biden administration, but I think I should wrap up there and save those thoughts for the discussion. So thanks very much for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Eisenberg. Next, we have Professor Murthy.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And I'm really thrilled to be part of this panel, which really just brings together such a diverse set of perspectives. I'm also going to share some slides. All right, so what I want to talk about is actually an idea that I'm developing around multi-scalar environmental justice. And this idea of a problem being multi-scalar is a phrase that is much more common in other disciplines like geography. But in many ways, when we think about the law, we think about a problem that is transcending multiple jurisdictional boundaries. And that's really what I mean by multi-scalar environmental justice. And I want to talk about this, this question in the context of access to drinking water, especially for Black and Brown poor communities. So infrastructure has certainly been on my mind because it's all in the news right now with everyone talking about Biden's proposed infrastructure plan, where there will in fact be additional funding for various kinds of water infrastructure. But one thing that has not actually gotten a lot of news attention is the fact that in recent congressional appropriations, we've actually had a really remarkable move, which is that Congress has actually funded the creation of a low-income household drinking water and wastewater emergency assistance program. So that was one act and an additional $500 million for low-income water assistance in the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. This is actually really a big deal. This is actual funding to states and Indian tribes to help low-income households that spend a large fraction of their income on drinking water. The idea is that they will be giving funds to utilities to reduce arrearage and adjust rates, and that they could build on program criteria that has been developed for other programs like the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, the LIHEAP program. And one of the things that I think is remarkable about this is I've been writing about the need for access for additional assistance for enhancing access to water. And so I think this is a really positive move. However, I think there's an important question to ask, which is this really just a Band-Aid or a long-term solution? And to really grapple with that question, I want to take us to Detroit. And in some ways, it's perfect that I'm following Professor Annie Eisenberg because she was talking about rural America, and I'm going to take us to Motor City, Detroit, a urban city with a majority Black population. It is not suffering from a lack of water. It is right on the Great Lakes. Yet we have had a lot of people whose household water has been shut off. So in 2014, this really skyrocketed to national and international attention. So you had people taking to the streets. You had the utilities actually marking homes with blue paint, kind of like a scarlet letter. And these shutoffs were honestly tied to much larger questions around the city's bankruptcy, the creation of a water authority in the region. But groups like the NAACP's LDF realized, wow, this and other situations around the country really propelled them to say, we need to be thinking about race and water affordability in America's cities. And I think something that Professor Krakoff said really resonated in the sense that often from an environmental law perspective, we're thinking about just the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. And a question around affordability is one that really transcends many different disciplines. It's sort of part poverty law, part health law, part utility law, and part environmental law. The Detroit shutoffs also even garnered international attention, with even the UN making a film about it. However, it's important to realize that this is a huge environmental justice problem. This map, which is from a recent lawsuit that was filed against Detroit, shows Detroit, and each quadrant, the color represents the percentage of Black population per zip code. So the darker the orange, the higher the percentage of the Black population. So this dark orange has 90 to 100% of the residents there are Black. That is where the big circles are. The big circles are water shutoffs per 1,000 people. There's a large correlation here between race and access to water. And yet the water shutoffs have continued over the last handful of years. Between 2014 and 2019, more than 141,000 households had their water service disconnected for non-payment. Then COVID happened. And all of a sudden, COVID has heightened everybody's awareness that we need water, not only for your own health and safety and dignity, but also as a public health measure, because washing hands is a really critical way to stop the spread of the disease. So finally, you had a little bit of movement in Detroit and in Michigan with a moratorium on shutoffs until actually just a few days ago, or about a week ago, March 31st. At least Detroit, though, the city said, okay, we're going to actually extend a moratorium on water shutoffs through 2022. Well, let me come back to this question of, is this are the moratorium shutoffs, is the the water assistance program that's being created by the federal government, is that going to solve the underlying problem of non-payment? Coming back to Detroit, after you had this huge wave of shutoffs about 5 years ago, you had the city saying, okay, well, we will create an affordability program where we're going to try to forgive part of the arrearages that people have. We're going to get them into payment plans. The reality is that a lot of experts said, this is actually bound to fail. And we saw it failing. Why? Because we saw that even after these affordability programs, assistance programs were being developed, there were still tons of shutoffs. Why? It's because the rates aren't actually being tied to people's income. And that economists that have studied this issue basically say, look, it's better to actually have a lower rate and get more people actually paying their bills on time, because people wouldn't in general want to pay on time if they're able to. And so there's a whole host of reasons why water has become incredibly expensive in a city like Detroit. Part of it is with the white flight and the vacancies and the foreclosures in the city that have led to a dwindling population, a massive infrastructure. Part of it is also because you have things like environmental standards like the Clean Water Act. So wastewater treatment is actually rather expensive. So let me come back to my larger point, which is that this is really a multi-scalar problem. Yes, we definitely need federal assistance here, and I am very supportive of the recent efforts and hope that there will be more federal funding. But this is a problem that transcends jurisdictional boundaries. So at the utility level, at the local scale, the utilities are often setting their rates based on, often with influence by, for example, a manual put out by the American Water Works Association, the M1 manual, doesn't have any reference to affordability. You also have states having laws that in some instances restrict the ability of a utility to actually offer rates that are pegged to somebody's income. So in Michigan, for example, there's a huge concern that if they were, for example, to charge somebody who is low income a lower rate compared to someone who is higher income, would that somehow be seen as an implicit tax? There was no lawsuit about that per se, but that concern led the city to move away from an affordability plan. Similarly, state laws that require rates to be not unduly discriminatory also raise concerns. Can we do this? But cities have done this. Like Philadelphia is really now the model for how water rates can in fact be affordable and address a really serious environmental justice problem. I've already talked about at the federal level, there's been a huge lack of funding historically to help with compliance, for example, with heightening standards around the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and Flint, Michigan is the poster child for what happens when you try to cut corners around these standards. And then finally, I would say that advocates reach up to international human rights law to basically say that when they're not finding any traction domestically, they're trying to look to human rights law to basically articulate that water is in fact really fundamental. And I think that this is a topic that to me really epitomizes this concept of intersectional environmentalism, because you have people who are predominantly Black and brown, low income, facing an environmental problem that is also a public health problem and a problem that we as a society need to be grappling with. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Murthy. We will have Professor Burkett next. I also want to quickly remind the audience, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A or chat functions. Okay, Professor Burkett.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be a part of this conversation. Wow, I'm learning so much just listening here as a co-panelist. I want to also echo all of the kudos and the gratitude for the organization of this sort of alternative gathering that we've had to come up with and come to from our various locations. I am wishing you all a very happy afternoon and aloha from Hawaii, where I am here in Honolulu on Native Hawaiian land. And I am going to dive right in because I know we were supposed to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, and I'm hoping to take us sort of around the globe and across 5 centuries of global history in order to sort of make my larger point. So I'm going to talk today about climate migration. And climate migration is something that I've been thinking a lot about alongside my work in climate justice, generally speaking. And over the last few years, well, decade or so, I've been looking at climate change and racial hierarchy in various forms. And there are sort of a number of interlinked propositions that have driven my work over the years, but I'll just share 2 with you that I really dive into in Root and Branch, which is sort of the current research project I'm working on, and a commentary is forthcoming in the Harvard Law Review Forum that sort of teases out some of the arguments. But I'll just share just sort of 2 of those propositions that shape my thinking about how we find just solutions when responding to, wicked crises like global climate migration, particularly cross-border migration. So the first proposition is that racism and racial hierarchy and environmental degradation, including climate change, have long been inextricably intertwined and have served as mutual accelerants. And these are sort of the background premises of a lot of the environmental justice and climate justice work that we've seen over the years. So what's different about what I'm looking at is trying to sort of make the link between human mobility as being a key feature of that. And in fact, and in many cases, and certainly during the early days of European exploration, it was unfettered and violent human mobility that has sort of ushered in this period of cascading crises that we're facing right now. The second proposition is that the law has been complicit in that racialized environmental degradation historically, and today is sort of inadequate in the face of these colliding crises, including climate change, including its geopolitical impacts. And researchers, would do well to look at that history broadly to understand the best pathways moving forward. So I'm definitely taking more of a global perspective in my talk, but I want to sort of underscore its domestic relevance as well. We see speaking of scales, familiar patterns repeat across all scales in a way that we can sort of learn from the various successes and failures historically to know what the best path forward would be. So one of the motivating notions is this statement by a physical scientist that's actually both terrifying and exhilarating to me, right? This is Sir David King. He was speaking about glacier melt in Greenland. He was speaking very technically about the impact of sea level rise on the physical map, but it seemed to sort of ring profoundly when thinking about post-colonial realities, settler colonialism, and the possibilities for redrawing maps of the world. But he's thinking about the ways in which the physical map, which is where climate engages, gets sort of disrupted. But if we look at the map that we've created, right, we see that the physical map is relevant to the experience of climate change, but the borders and jurisdictions that we have created may be even more relevant to the experience of that change and the severity of that experience. It's important, of course, to understand that the borders that we see, the boundaries that we see, how firm they are, affect our ability to even mitigate the climate crisis because of the notion of that borders meaningfully define or delimit national interests. We can also note that in the Global South in particular, those borders were imposed, generally speaking, by external forces. And we should note that today, the sort of strength of the nation state, the idea of sovereignty is buttressed, if not defined by that right to exclude others, right? That right to exclude non-citizens. So that formidable right to exclude reinforces the strength of the nation state. Although I like notion state now that I've said it. And we know that many international law scholars, especially those working in migration, have identified that right to exclude as being in direct conflict with the needs of migrants, right? And so the collision of the political and the physical map is just sort of starkly evinced by what we see here, right? This is an image that was taken in the closing days of the previous presidential administration. This was after the election. This was the continued effort to dynamite blast a canyon in Arizona to build a border wall. I can't imagine a better example, visual example of border as construct, right? But the force that political border and the mode of racialized exclusion that the border has come to represent, right? Literally dynamite blasting it into what would otherwise be a pristine landscape. And then of course, when you look at the image, you'd be hard pressed to know which country's which. I've sort of led you astray by putting the US on the left, but it's in fact Mexico. But we see there that this is a coherent space that is being carved by our essentially commitment to what I would argue is an antiquated jurisprudence with respect to the nation state. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this in the context of what's happening right now. And I don't, unfortunately, have enough time to sort of go through all of the details, what we know about climate-induced migration. I hope that if there are questions that you'll ask during our Q&A portion of the discussion, but we are in the midst of seeing this crisis play out. We're seeing the collision of environmental degradation and climate change and racialized exclusion, as well as that racialized exclusion operating sort of outside of the boundaries of even the United States itself. Here we're seeing, this is an opinion piece, but it's citing the facts, which is to say that the record hurricane season that we saw in 2020 produced two storms, Eta and Iota, that struck Central America, in particular the Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, countries that have already been afflicted by climate-induced drought for a decade, which has already left 3.5 million people facing food insecurity. So on top of that, the floods from those storms produced even more severe impacts. 1,200 schools were damaged or destroyed, 40% of corn crops and 65% of the bean harvest were lost. And there's other social science research and data that's showing, has been for at least a decade now, the connection between that climate change, reduced crop yields, and sort of the pushes or drivers to migrate as a result of failing food viability and security in the regions. So it seems to me that when we think about climate-induced migration, we think about its history and its present, there's sort of few other impacts of climate change that so neatly encapsulate the ability for climate change to rock the foundations of our legal order, our political dialogue, and to force us to think across multiple spaces, force us to understand, again, how the sort of the strict borders that we place in the law itself on top of racialized exclusion and racial hierarchy have put us into quite a predicament. Migration itself, from notions of agency and self-determination to fixed concepts of the nation state, is really pressing the issue and begging for new and dynamic legal frameworks and paradigms. I want to just sort of take a moment to bring you closer to where I am, which is in the Pacific. While climate forecasters deem small islanders as among the most vulnerable to climate change impacts, a subset of small islanders like the Marshallese from the Republic of the Marshall Islands also face the specter of permanent loss of habitable state territory, rendering them migrants without a home country. And so the RMI is particularly emblematic of the root issues that we're really struggling with and the sort of the tragedy at the base of them when you consider climate migration pressures that are now sitting on top of colonial histories, as well as its history of being subject to dozens of island obliterating US nuclear bomb tests, including the storied Bravo test, the most powerful nuclear device detonated by the US at the Bikini Atoll. That was the first sort of making of an island to disappear, displaced Bikini Islanders to other islands within the atoll nation, and then sea level rise is further displacing the islanders out of the Marshall Islands in the last decade, so that they're seeking to buy land here in Hawaii in order to have a safe, dry ground to sit upon. So there's much I could say about this, but I will first say that as we think about the sort of the decision making moving forward, that the mobility options that we see many exposed to today are circumscribed by increasingly antiquated 20th century parameters for movement. It includes a move to the rare neighboring country that allows unrestricted entry, formal international migration programs that facilitate entry into sort of higher income and global north countries, such as the skilled worker visa programs, and the extra legal, clandestine, and often life-threatening journeys to another country to seek asylum, again, the failure of which we're seeing across the globe. There are also several spheres of governance and related institutions that could own this issue because of its cross-cutting nature, particularly into fields that don't understand themselves to be environmental, like we don't do climate. The challenge of climate-induced migration can continue to evade focused attention. No one policy community is obligated to respond. Climate migrants can't hold any one entity accountable for its failure to respond. And so with that, crises compound, the first being the disaster, the second being the legal or political system that can't accommodate the change. I just show this image just to suggest that if we don't figure this out, right, we have to solve for this, and I think that sounds obvious, but I think the we in that becomes really important because those of us here that are concerned about rights, justice, and equity in the problem solving would need to understand that in the absence of that problem solving with rights and justice at the forefront, there's a vibrant conversation about how to make those borders stronger, smarter, more weaponized in order to continue exclusion. I tell my students if they think they're getting too much sleep at night, they can read this book to keep them up. Because again, the failures in our ability to lean in and to have a historical understanding of it is impeding our ability to solve in a timely fashion. And we can see that the 21st century story is even older. And this is where the root part of the root and branch research is heading. I'm looking a lot at how we got to where we are in terms of racialized differences of the change in climate, heat extremes in Nigeria that are both devastating as a public health matter, food security matter, but also literally rendering the country poorer than it would otherwise be. Displacements in our country along the Carolinas that are racialized themselves and for which we see heartache as well as the effects of a hurricane killing those who are displaced. Research again is showing us that this is a longer story. I will, for time, sort of save some of this for after the formal presentation, but suffice it to say that mutual acceleration that we saw in racial hierarchy and environmental degradation is as old as the sort of first ships leaving Europe. That the great dying of the indigenous peoples was the first indication of sort of global impact of human activity on global temperatures. The Great Divergence is that moment in history that in which Europeans departed from other continents, which at the time were all sort of equally situated because of the ability to access resources that wouldn't otherwise be accessed, enslavement, colonialism, and their long aftermath solidifying that. So as we look to the past, we get the opportunity for better futures. There are a number of researchers like Tendayo Uchume, cross disciplines, migration law in particular, that we can look to. Professor Carmen Gonzalez has always been intersectional in her work and thinking about migration as reparations. And I think a lot of what's been said earlier, certainly by Professor Steele and Professor Krakoff, with respect to how we think about decision making, how we think about that influencing the progression of our larger sort of response to these issues in our jurisprudence, that we will get to the kinds of solutions that we're looking to implement with justice as a priority. A full articulation of that is not likely to come in time. I say that we have to build the solar plane as we fly it. I actually think what we're seeing coming out of the Biden administration, which I will spend more time on during the Q&A if there's time, is actually going to be key. That in fact, this was a game changer, not just the recognition of climate change on the impact of migration and those who are finding themselves in refugee type scenarios, but the fact that it's together, it's discussed. It is a section in the executive order. It is too easy to say it's a departure from the prior administration. It is much more accurate to say it is a departure from any iteration that we've seen or any diagnosis that we've seen, certainly, of an administration on a problem and the ways in which they'd like to collaborate to fix it. So I will pause there and thank you for your time, and I look forward to our discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Professor Burkett. And thank you to all the panelists. You've given us a lot to think with. We already have a few questions in the chat and Q&A, and I promise we'll get to as many as we can in the rest of our time. I'm going to kick off the discussion with just a broad question referring back to the title of this panel. So can you elaborate on how your research fits within what the panel summary describes as a, quote, forward-looking vision for the emerging field of intersectional environmentalism? And if you could design a comprehensive strategy for the Biden-Harris administration to implement this vision, what would it be? So broad questions, anyone who feels welcome to take up any part of that question, please feel free.
Everyone's going to be shy. I'll start, and then and I'll try to be brief so that my brilliant fellow panelists can pipe up and we get to the student Q&A. I think I'll just get straight to the second part of the question, Kevin, because I at least address some sort of a working definition of intersectional environmentalism in my comments, and I'll let others speak about how it fits into their work if they choose to. Here's an approach I think would be really an amazing and concrete way to put a lot of what the Biden administration has issued already in its executive orders. Professor Burkett showed us one, and there are several in my fields too that just, it's like, wow, this is the language we've all been waiting for, right? There's the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. There was a memo, a presidential memorandum resurrecting and promising to sort of revitalize the Obama memorandum on tribal consultation, and I could go on, right? I mean, so my suggestion to the administration would be that they put those executive orders, all those goals into place, like literally, and take a regional approach. And you know, I have the best developed idea for the region I already spoke about. The Department of the Interior is the lead agency on in the landscape of the Colorado Plateau, because there's so much public land, there's so much tribal land, and there's a lot of endangered species issues, right? Every issue you can think of, like, is run through that administration. And so if the Department of the Interior, for example, were to take a lead on a kind of just transitions regional landscape approach, and starting with the grassroots activists and advocates throughout that region, and there are many who have been advocating on these issues, you know, how to create a just and sustainable livelihood, you know, an economy not based on growth per se, but on what sustains traditional Navajo, Hopi, Zuni relationships with the landscape. They're there. They've been working on it. They have ideas, and this administration really could. They have the people. They have the personnel. They could say, we're going to take a region-wide approach, an interagency approach, bring in DOE when necessary to come up with a bottom-up. I mean, it sounds weird, but I think if there were the commitment to work, a government-led, bottom-up, just transition approach. And I think that could be replicable for other regions like Alaska, like the coastal areas that Maxine was talking. I have a hard time sticking with last names. Sorry, I don't even call my students by the last name. Professor Burkett was talking about. So I'll stop there, but that's one idea I had for how to move from EO and a big idea to actually making things happen in place for communities.
I can build on that. And so I would say I'll answer both your questions. So one is, I think that this notion of intersectional environmentalism is one that is really of the times. I think we increasingly recognize with the racial justice reckoning in this world that the environment is not just for white upper class people who want to go hiking, right? The environment is for all of us. And that no matter your skin color, no matter where you live, things that I deal with around sort of access to sort of basic things you need for living, like access to water and clean air, those are not commodities. And so I see this as just kind of an important term that is kind of gaining traction nationally, that builds on just, I think it ties into environmental justice, but it sort of is even broader. I echo what Professor Krakoff, Sarah said, but I actually want to share an idea that I actually heard Jennifer Granholm, who is the former governor of Michigan and now the Secretary of Department of Energy. I heard her give a speech and I thought it was a really good idea. And she said, we need to be incentivizing states in the way in which, for example, in the field of education, No Child Left Behind. Even if you don't agree with exactly how that played out in terms of standardized testing or whatever, it created a race to the top. And I heard her talk about this in the context of clean energy. And in the last 2 decades, we've had, for example, in the climate change field, no movement nationally, right? And so you've had states developing, whether it's renewable portfolio standards or changing, whatever the various policies that have happened at the state and local level, tying some of the federal funding and some of the goals to incentivizing states and local governments to do this. And in the field of water that I just talked about, I think this is huge because I would love to see some of the thorny issues that happen very locally. So I saw in the chat, we can come to that later, that a lot of this stuff is very, very, very local. And it's very hard, but federal dollars can get a lot done if they're incentivized the right way.
I'll go ahead and chime in just because I have a couple of thoughts that may diverge slightly, although I agree with everything that's been said before. I think when we think about intersectional environmentalism, it's going to sort of bust open our notion of what environmentalism is, right? And so, in fact, it's the environment as we've described it before has been profoundly compartmentalized and specific and reflected the typical identities for, the sort of environmentalist and the rugged individual and the mountaineer and all of those sorts of things. But environmental justice has always been about, the refrain was where you live, work, and play. And so what does that mean when we think about what decision-making will look like that's going to be responsive to the environment as it's broadly understood, more broadly understood than the more traditional American, white American perhaps, identity with respect to where the environment is and who gets to have a good one. I do think that it's always been intersectional. It's just that we didn't necessarily see it as such or claim it as such because, again, our we'd sort of circumscribed our definitions, our understandings of the environment so much so that it has been very specific. And even our environmental law and the regulatory regime has reflected a very, to quote Usha Natarajan, who thinks, I think brilliantly in this way, a very impoverished understanding what the environment is and what nature encompasses. And so when I think about climate change and describe all of the changes that need to happen and the fact that it's the context, not an issue, I use sort of this airplane analogy, which is terrible for fossil fuel purposes. But if you think about it, we're all in the fuselage, right? And we're in different classes, we're experiencing life in the sort of space. And in fact, we have thought about the environment as the air filtration system and the bathrooms and very specific ways in which the fuselage is cleaned over time. But in fact, it's the environment, it's the space around us, it's the atmosphere around us, and it's turbulent, and it's increasingly turbulent. And it's increasingly turbulent such that no one sort of escapes, but each person's experience or discomfort relative to that increase in turbulence is varying. Are you in the back with the crying baby? Are you in first class, right? This is the sort of difference. But if we think about the environment as context, there's no way out of that, right? And so no matter what you're doing, it's going to be dictated by the quality of that space and your relationship to it. In terms of specifically what we're seeing out of the EOs in Biden, and especially when I know about what's happening with respect to foreign policy and climate policy, what I think is encouraging is that sort of broader understanding of climate change, at least, as a reflection of a failure in our environmental management and our understandings of environment, relationship to it, but is that they are not seeing it possible to have foreign policy that doesn't understand climate policy as a key element of it, right? So it is broadly understood to be everyone's mandate. Or at least that's what senior leadership, it seems, is also taking, and I think is alongside the EO like this is really meaningful, which is to say, we don't just do environment over here in this office, we're all doing it. And we all understand that we have to because of the 21st century demands.
I have one thing to add, I guess. Several years ago, I co-authored a piece called Just Environmentalism. And I guess this would be one way that I would encourage the Biden administration to think about these is if we think of environmental justice traditionally as combating the citing of environmental harms, where those concentrate the harms of disfavored or harmful uses, concentrate the costs of that onto minority communities, the politically voiceless, traditionally. In Just Environmentalism with my co-authors, Lisa Sun and Brigham Daniels, we suggested, at least as far as that study, that when we cite and locate environmental protections, that those also have externalities, and that we ought to think about that we don't repeat those kinds of harms, that we think about the costs that come that are associated with the location and citing of environmental protections, and that we don't repeat the mistake and impose those externalities disproportionately on those on minority communities or the politically vulnerable. So I would just say that that's another suggestion I would have for the incoming Biden administration as they figure out whether it's the Green New Deal or something like that, that they think about the costs also of vital environmental protections, that those come with externalities as well.
I love that point, and I will jump in with I think one of the threads here in terms of the comment that was made about sort of busting open our notion of what environmentalism is. And it's so interesting to hear the juxtaposition of there's been so much grassroots environmental justice advocacy for decades, if not centuries. And then meanwhile, environmentalism, whatever it is, environmental law, there's still this kind of elitism problem that I think we see in a variety of different forms, including the temptation for kind of strict, rigid, top-down governance. And so I think that a question that we're all kind of looking at is how can environmental law, how can environmentalism capture more of the grassroots spirit from the variety of sort of geographies and communities we're looking at. And yeah, I will stop there.
Great. I will pick up on what Professor Eisenberg just mentioned and ask a self-interested question, which is how do you all think intersectional environmentalism and its vision be incorporated into the law school curriculum, and how the fields of environmental law, energy law, natural resources law, and other areas of law, how those areas of law are traditionally taught?
I can start since we could reverse course there. One experience that's been really interesting for me as a law professor is I teach the environmental law clinic, which is mostly third-year students, and I teach first-year property, and I'm pretty new to doing that. And it's been interesting to see the really different expectations for what kind of is and isn't on the table in those two different environments. So clinic, it's like, yeah, you're the radical social justice people, go nuts. First year courses, I'm a clinician, it's my background. I'm bringing that perspective to the table, but I've had it be sort of treated as novel that I've been talking about racial justice and property so much, which seems both good and bad, I guess, in that I'm allowed to do that. I have tenure now. So I just wonder if that's, individual professors have a lot of agency in terms of just reshaping the content that they center. So that's one very simple idea to start off with there.
Since we're going reverse order, and one thing I would like to see, and one thing I'm committed to doing, especially after today, is ensuring that students have the opportunity not just to be confined by a casebook, but to read the scholarship of people like the panelists today, and hear those voices and begin to engage with the academic conversation, whether that's through paper courses or other ways that encourage them to get into the pages of the law reviews and the articles that really intersectional academics are bringing to the table.
I think I'm next up, and I will just say that sort of like my previous comments, I think we need to sort of bust up the curriculum. And I mean this in the sense that it actually really concerns me that we have, sort of a cohort of leaders that are graduating from law school with limited understanding of the environment, literally the environment with which they will be practicing. And I'll just tell a quick story to convey this. I was talking to another environmental law colleague who teaches at a California school, saying that we should be teaching climate change at least throughout the entire curriculum. And he was like, well, I can't really imagine my bankruptcy colleague teaching about climate change. And then just coincidentally, another colleague was sitting across the table, not a law professor, didn't do environmental work per se. She was sort of like, I just kind of feel like the PG&E attorneys would probably have wanted to know what their asset liability might have been as a bankruptcy. And it was sort of like, yeah, right, exactly, right? Like we are seeing this as, again, just an issue, just sort of like, how are we filtering the air? How are we dealing with our waste? Rather than what is the environment that is actually shaping our ability to be effective, to thrive, to survive in some cases over time. So Klaus Bosselman is a scholar and law professor out of the University of Auckland, and he's actually written a fair amount about the fact that we are saddling environmental law with saving the forest, but it really only has domain over the tree, right? That we actually want environmental law and international environmental law and the Paris Agreement, for example, to totally, sort of reframe and redesign our global political economy. But really, the WTO needs to, in international investment law is where it's at, commercial law is where it's at, the Treasury treasuries where that a lot of that work needs to happen. And so that integration that we're seeing from the Biden administration, the whole of government approach is a beginning, I think, admission of that. But I think we should see that across our curricula at all of the law schools, at all of the universities, because leaders today, young leaders need to know the future that they will be attempting to lead others in.
So if you'd like us all to answer every question, I know we're not going to get, I think, to everyone's question in the Q&A. I mean, I would echo what everybody said. I think number one, we also need to get the bar examiners to get on board because, at least a lot of the first year curriculum is 100% geared towards in looking at the bar curriculum, passage of the bar. But I also think what's really helpful is, very practically, to the extent to which we are also like these efforts that are happening in the Biden administration right now, even with these executive orders, to the extent to which they are actually translating down into sort of these kind of discussions becoming mainstream, right? And then all of a sudden now people advising companies are like, oh, well, we need to actually really consider, whatever the case may be, that we need to be focusing in on questions of environmental justice, social justice. There's community pressure around this. Shareholders want it, public wants it. I just think that's the kind of shift that you need externally as well. But in terms of what we actually teach, I support what everyone, I don't have much else to say beyond what my colleagues said.
And I'll just add quickly I've thought about busting open the concept of the environment from the other end too in the curriculum. So not only have issues of, the world we live in, i.e. the environment in every class, but also to have every class consider environmental issues. In other words, I think poverty law is environmental law, criminal law is environmental law. Think about where we cite prisons for one thing, and how much more open space there would be if we would not cite any more prisons. And of course, people in cages don't have any environmental, et cetera, right? So all law, I think all law is environmental law, just like environmental law should infuse all other classes too. So to do it in reverse. And then I'll just give one specific example that I undertook, a project I undertook last summer and fall with one of my amazing students as an RA, is we totally revamped our Foundations of Natural Resources Law curriculum so that it has, the racial exclusion, racial inclusion, racial justice, different perspectives, Native nations, the land displacement, et cetera, all woven throughout the story of how we came to have an environmental regulatory state, so that even if students never take another environmental law class again, they don't come away with what I used to teach it every time, like the story of great white men and how they helped us, arrive, and an idea about, saving big beautiful places. And so that's another thing, is to teach environmental justice too, but to incorporate the justice, the intersectional environmentalism into every environmental course as well.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just gonna pull from a couple of our audience questions in the last few minutes that we have, and some of them are related, so I'm just gonna pair them. We have a couple of questions related to water. One is, or specifically for Professor Murthy, I should say, wouldn't a more direct solution to the water rate problem to have a national minimum income standard with adjustments for local variations in cost of living? And another water-related question is, how are we supposed to square the principles Professor Steele shared with a localized / federalized / privatized water system? Do we need to decommodify water, or are there different price structures we should propose that are aligned with equity principles? Can incentivize behaviors that anticipate the increasing scarcity of water and is politically palatable?
Great, so great questions. As to the first question, the answer is yes, I wish that was the case. We could just have but we don't. I mean, and part of that gets to the fact that water is so local, and it is the way in which even, we kind of have to get into utility law here, which once again, doesn't really seem environmental, but is so important in terms of, and sort of local and state government law, but things like You know, a lot of utilities now are saddled with a lot more costs. And water infrastructure is like lumpy, i.e. you have to like put in a lot of investments up front, and then you've got to actually like figure out how to cost recover it. And historically, there used to be a lot more cross subsidization, and now there's a lot more focus on, well, you got to meet the bottom line, and you got to make sure that you have the revenue, and all of those create pressures on the system. And I think the reality is that at the local level, utility managers are just thinking of it like a fiscal matter. They're not thinking of it necessarily in the way that we're talking about it here. And there are legal barriers in some states around, can you actually set water rates that would be affordable? Now, part of the question got to, is there might you be inadvertently incentivizing people to misuse water? And it isn't, but what's interesting is that there's been a lot of water conservation measures actually have the tendency to actually increase rates because there's more, because there's less demand. But there are ways that you can structure tariffs. For example, you could think about what other countries have done like a minimum basic amount of water that everyone gets just for your basic needs. And then beyond that, you could have a rising block tariff. Anyway, so we could talk sort of all kind of like nerd out on all the utility stuff. But let me just stop there and maybe turn it over to Professor Steele to maybe comment and reflect back, make a connection that the audience members saw between our talks.
Yeah, so one of the things I have argued is an opportunity for the Biden administration, an opportunity for not just the American people, but beyond, is to listen to and elevate the voices of Indigenous values. And what I think we heard at Standing Rock, the refrain we heard was water is sacred. So when you ask, should we decommodify water? Yeah, what if we thought about it as, whatever the, sort of governmental equivalent of sacred is, right? Precious, vital, life affirming. Water is life, water is sacred. That was the refrain we heard coming out of Standing Rock. And I don't think that's consistent with it as a sort of a commodity that gets monetized and gets sort of distributed among uses, despoiled in some sense. So I think I'm not sure that reconciles it, but I think there is that principle. We have a choice. Will we listen to the wisdom, the accumulated wisdom of the Indigenous people who know how to survive on this land?
Yeah, and I would just say that these are debates that internationally people are having. And when sort of internationally, a decade ago, there was a recognition of a right to water, it was grounded in that idea, right? That and I think that the way in which it's often translated as a policy matter is that there's sort of a minimum basic amount that people should have as a matter of dignity, but that there's a certain amount of, but like, if you're going to be watering a golf course, that may not be falling into your sacred use, right? So that there are lines that can be drawn, but I agree that it's a policy choice that we as a society need to make.
Okay, we have one last audience question which I'd like to pose to the panelists if they're okay. I know we're up on time, but it's just to kind of get through the audience questions. We have one for Professor Burkett. What concrete changes to the legal design of border security do you anticipate as climate migration increases? Are you nervous about the rhetoric of smarter borders with the Biden administration? And I'll piggyback on this just to kind of, this was also a similar question to have. I had, how should we think about intersectional environmentalism on a global perspective, and whether or not framing climate change through the lens of national security risks, centering American interests over those of other countries, especially those in the global South, and how do we implement intersectional environmentalism in a way that is cognizant and directly addresses those inequities?
Okay, that's a big one. And I will say that that has been a real struggle over the time that I've been working, especially in migration, because the hyper-securitization of migration across borders everywhere, but certainly here in the US, is incredibly troubling. And so to highlight the notion that, the data that suggests that there will be more movement and dislocation can have the exact opposite impact, which is to say, let's close those borders, let's and use smart borders in, I think, a substantively different way, which is to say, the trade rooms that have these weaponized drones that are on display for use along the border, and so the increasing violence that can happen at the border becomes, even more of concern if we just see that that migration is one that we respond to with fear versus sort of innovation or a spirit of welcome, which I think is a very different orientation. And I think that there is at least some understanding of that, in that the migration approaches that are being recommended, at least in the very thin EO, while it's going to the National Security Advisor, it is including, I think, elements along the chain of migration that we need to be mindful of, which is to say that there is an attention to what gets you to a border in the first place. Most people want to stay in place, and there are conditions that are not allowing for that. So one of the more distressing elements of immigration policy under the prior administration was the absence of aid, or the pulling back of aid, or even more importantly, the increase of harm, right? Because I think a big part of our policy will be doing less harm in these spaces, thinking differently about extraction, thinking differently about how we're doing harm and degrading the places where people would like to stay, but are going to have a harder time adapting because of the colliding crises, again, of consumption, extraction, and climate change. So thinking about migration broadly, I think will allow us to understand that the border, once we're at the border, we've already failed, and that we're going to need to look more so at the full process that forces one to leave the space that they call their home, or in the Pacific, where you're situated and you're landed, you're part of the land, and you don't want to leave the bones of your ancestors. And so that becomes a really critical, I think, perspective shift as well.
Great, thank you so much. So we are up on time. So before we close things out, I just want to thank the panelists for sharing their work and insights with us tonight. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us this evening. The next conference panel will be on April 22nd at noon Eastern time, and we'll explore critical theory and law reform, past and future. You can learn more about the details of that event and register for it on the LPE project's website. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening, or whatever time of day it is.
Thank you so much.